Welcome to episode 5 of the Modular Cookbook. When I was imagining today's patch, I thought it would be something like a lullaby, major and consonant and soothing, but the more I experimented with it, the more I found myself drawn to intervals that were a little bit off, that allowed for some dissonance and some spooky stuff to happen. Moments that make you go, instead of just, Generative music is fascinating to me, and that umbrella covers a huge amount of territory. On one end of the generative spectrum, maybe you have something like asynchronous loops, where you stack a few loops of different lengths. Maybe they're arbitrary lengths that aren't pinned to any common rhythmic framework, which means it might take hours or weeks or years to ever fall into the same pattern twice. Brian Eno's music for airports is the first example that I encountered of this, and it's what originally got me turned on to this technique. Actually, before that, I had a friend who was kind of into experimental jazz, and at parties he would keep 2 different CDs playing on 2 stereos at the same time across the room from each other, which I guess is sort of a variation on this technique. And it's a pretty accessible point of entry because the pitches and the timbres are all recorded intentionally, and only the timing is left up to the machines. All the way on the other side of the spectrum, we have something like a Douglas Leedy's and Tropical Paradise or Morton Subotnick's Silver Apples of the Moon, stuff that's a lot more chaotic and leaves a lot of parameters up to chance. Controlled randomness, which I use a ton of on this channel, can be used to modulate some aspect of a voice in a random way, like applying a stepped random value per note to a parameter, such as an oscillator's pulse width or an envelope's decay time. A small amount of random variation can take a boring, static part and really liven it up. I'm not exactly sure where one would draw the line between capital G generative music and just throwing in a little randomization to keep a part interesting. Also, who cares? But I think today's patch can be pretty safely called generative music. We're using 3 voices spaced out by octaves. Let's talk about who's doing what. We, the human side of this collaboration, are choosing our root note. I'm tuning to a C. We choose what scale we'll constrain our notes to, or if we want to even quantize to a scale at all. I'm using a Lydian scale. We choose the range of notes available to each voice. For example, I could constrain the bass to choose random notes from a single octave, or maybe let the high pluck choose notes from a 1.5 or 2 octave range. The machine is choosing what notes to play by way of an analog shift register for each voice, but it always follows the rules I've made for it, and at any point I can tell the machine to stop randomizing and loop the last X number of randomly generated steps. We'll call this locking the loop. We are choosing the timbre and the character of each voice, and we're making decisions about the space the music lives in. By choosing to use a static spring reverb at the end of my chain, I'm choosing to place the music in a large, sort of dark reflective space. If we were to randomize some effect parameters, like the amount of dry signal being sent to the reverb, or if you have a digital reverb like an herb verb or a clouds running Oliverb on the Parasite firmware, we could randomize some of the reverb's parameters, which would mean relinquishing some control over the perceived space to the whims of the machine. Also in our control, we are the ones choosing the rhythmic structure through a combination of Euclidean patterns and logic. But this is where, to me, the line starts to get blurry. When you have 3 Euclidean patterns all playing different length loops, and they're interacting with each other through logic gates, and they're triggering notes stored in 3 separate shift registers that may all have different numbers of steps, a ton of complexity emerges. It doesn't sound like a few simple sets of instructions anymore. It sounds interesting, and if we do it right, it can sound composed, it can sound human. I haven't done the math on this patch, but you could. Once the shift registers are locked to whatever random voltages the machine has spit out and that we've chosen to keep, there is some common denominator for all these rhythmic relationships that you could calculate, and you could say, yes, this whole thing is one big loop that will repeat precisely every 6.5 days or every 4 months or whatever it is. The math is interesting to think about, but math isn't my strong point, and again, we're making music here, so to me, if it feels random, or if it feels endless, or in some way feels out of my hands, maybe it's generative. In this patch, I've also left open some doors for manual control over parameters that I think are interesting. Probably the most significant influence that we have over the composition is that we are cherry-picking and looping the melodies that we like from the random voltage generators, which is a great example of a two-way conversation between a nerd and a machine. I've also got a delay send on the high voice and a portamento or a glide effect on the middle voice, which I'm choosing to operate manually, either with a knob or with this infrared doohickey, in response to what the machine does. One of my favorite sweet spots spots for a generative patch is where there's enough machine-generated novelty to keep me interested and to keep me guessing, and enough manual control that I can react to the machine's output in a way that feels like a conversation. My rule of thumb tends to be, let everything do what it's best at. In this case, the machine is way better than I am at timing, which is something that any of my former bandmates would be happy to confirm. It's way better at executing instructions in a reliable way. It's good at never getting bored or confused. It's good at not falling into familiar patterns in the way that I am when I put my hands on a piano and find myself reaching for those familiar chord shapes. But I'm the one with the ears, and I'm the one that gets to decide what sounds good and what gets recorded, and sometimes just having a little bit of input to the system can be enough to make some magic happen. Today's patch is an example of something generative that feels balanced and satisfying to me, and I hope you find something interesting in it to take back to your own explorations. Before we patch, big thanks to everyone who offered up feedback in response to last week's video. I think this channel is becoming what I want it to be, and I'm glad the content is, for the most part, hitting the mark. Based on what's come back to me, I'll try to be less timid about doing longer intros like this, and I won't be so afraid of these little digressions into my thoughts on theory or practice when I think they're interesting and relevant. Oh, and one more thing. There was a great suggestion to have guests share patches on the channel, and I'm thinking about ways to make that a reality. If there's an artist that you think would be a good fit for this channel, I'd love it if you would drop a name in the comments. Wake up. Modular Cookbook. Alright, let's build this patch. This is going to be fun. So this patch uses 3 voices, and they're going to be pretty traditional subtractive synthesizer voices. I'm going to use the 3 oscillators from this trident, each of which will be going through a different filter. Then after the filter, each voice is going to go into a VCA and be mixed together, and then sent to a reverb and out. So the first thing I'll do here, just so it's done, is get my oscillators tuned up. I'll take a triangle wave out of each of these oscillators, patch them all into a mixer, then take the output of my mixer and I'll patch it into the input of my spring reverb. This is going to be at the end of my chain today, so I already patched this to the input on my monitors. I'll bring up oscillator 1. Let's work in C today. I'll use my Ableton tuner to get this oscillator to a C. Get it close and use a fine. I'll tune my next oscillator, also to a C, but I'll go an octave up. And I'll tune my third oscillator an octave up from that. These pots are kind of scratchy on here. That's okay. So now I'll pull these wires, and my 3 oscillators are now each tuned to a C note, 3 octaves apart. Alright, let's build a bass voice first. I'll take a triangle output of oscillator 1 into the input of this MS-22. And before I go any further, I should say, I'm building these with oscillator into filter, into VCA, into mixer, because that's what I have, and that's a sound that I like, and that's the system that I've built. But there are a lot of ways to approach this. If you have something like a voice in a module, like a Platts, or noise engineering has a bunch of modules that will accept trigger inputs, and they're kind of a complete voice in one module. I'm not super familiar with that part of the market, but a voice like that would be really well suited for the patch we're doing today, especially if you don't have enough VCAs and filters to follow along with what I'm doing. I would recommend choosing something that can have sort of a mellow timbre though. The way these things are going to overlap, if you start using waves that are too bright, it's going to sound nasty. But hey, maybe that's what you like. And I'm using this MS-22 because it has both a low pass and a high pass filter in series, and basses that come out of synthesizers, especially when you're using simple waves like this, tend to be very, very bassy. And even though in a patch like this where I'm not going to have any drums, so I'm not really worried about a conflict between my kick and my bass, I am a little concerned that the bass is just going to be too heavy and too meaty, and that I might want to just roll off some of the fundamental and let the harmonics shine. So this output goes to input 1 on my Tangle Quartet. It's a quad VCA and mixer. I'm using the Tangle Quartet to mix my oscillators for this patch because the VCAs and the mix path are just very clean. I noted in last week's episode that I was kind of pleasantly surprised by how nicely the Veils responds when you push it hard and overdrive it, but I don't want that kind of character on this patch, so I'm using Clean Friend. I'll take my mix output and patch it into the input of another mixer, and I'll explain that in a minute. The output of this mixer is going to go to the input of my spring reverb, which is at the end of the chain for today's patch. The mix output is going straight to my recorder. Also, speaking of outputs, you might have noticed that there's no output module in my system, and that is because I use a DI box. Inputs on the front, 15 dB pads, 1/4 inch throughs, balanced mic level outputs that go to the preamps on your interface or mixer. I don't know if this is a common solution to cooling down eurorack level outputs, but it works pretty well, and if you get a DI that has these 15 dB pads, it'll pretty much take anything you throw at it. Also, it's just a good problem solver to have around the studio, and if you show up to play a live set and you have your own DI box with you, the sound engineer will have instant respect for you, and they will know that you are serious about your sound. Anyway, where were we? Right, bass. Open up the VCA, open up the filter. Next, we'll need an envelope, so I'll take the output of envelope 1 on the quadrax, I'll patch it into the filter cutoff CV, and mult it to the VCA. I'll use PAMs to trigger the envelope, and we'll start it up. Now, usually in these videos, what I've been doing is starting with PAMs from a reset state, and I dial up all the settings on camera, but I think I'm gonna stop doing that because I raced through it, I wind up editing most of that out, and you can't see the screen anyway, so I'll still put up the titles at the top that have all the settings. My next move is to mult this gate output into trigger input 1 on the Ornament and Crime. The Ornament and Crime is running the Quantermain app, and today we're going to explore the Turing Machine functionality. And I guess now would be as good a time as any to have a little primer on what a Turing Machine is in eurorack and how we use it. And for that, I'm going to pull up VCV Rack. Okay, here we are in VCV Rack. I built basically the same voice that we have over on my hardware synth. I'm using this LFO as a clock, I'm triggering a function with it, and the clock is also multed to the clock input of this Turing Machine. I'll patch the output of the Turing Machine into my oscillator's volt per octave input. Now, with every clock pulse that the Turing Machine receives, it's generating a random voltage that's being used to control the frequency of our oscillator. When the big knob here is at the 12 o'clock position, all the values are random. Now, as we move this big knob clockwise, the likelihood of each step becoming randomized grows less and less, to the point where if we move it all the way to 5 o'clock, it loops a sequence. And the number of steps it loops is determined by the length knob. We're looping 4 steps right now. 5, 8. Let's do 3. And I believe if you move this knob all the way counterclockwise, it does the same thing, but it just loops double the amount of steps that are on the length knob. Grab another 4-step sequence. The scale knob adjusts the range of those random voltages from medium to wide to nothing at all. And that's pretty much it. Those are the 3 parameters we need to know about. How random is it? How long is the sequence? And what's the note spread? In the Ornament and Crime, each of the 4 channels can be set up as a Turing Machine, which is pretty sweet considering how small it is. We've already got a clock input to channel 1, so I'll take the CV output of channel 1 and run it into the volt per octave on oscillator number 1 and see what we get. And we'll find all the controls that are on the front panel of the Turing Machine in the menu here. We have our range. I'll set it to 14. We've got our probability, which is the same as the big knob on the Turing Machine. It's just the probability that the next step will be randomized. And for some reason, the ranges on all these are different. You know, this probability setting goes from 0 to 255. The range goes from 0 to 120. I'm not quite sure why that is, but I know that when you set the probability to 0, it locks the loop. And we have our LFSR length. LFSR stands for Linear Feedback Shift Register. And my sequence length is 5. I like 5 steps. Using the encoder to flip through all these values is kind of a bummer, so let's hook up some external CV so we have hands-on control over the randomization. I'll grab an offset from the SPO and run it into CV input of channel 1, and there's a setting on the menu, LFSR, probability CV, and we've set it to CV1. So now we don't have to scroll through the values with these encoders. We can set the probability to 0, which means that the loop is locked by default, and then as I feed it a positive CV, it'll start to randomize. Back to 0. Now, you do give up some things by having 4 of these Turing Machines in one 8 HP module. That's life. I don't particularly need a dedicated control for the sequence length or the range for this, so I'm in good shape. Oh, another really nifty control of this Ornament and Crime is that you can offset each channel in octaves. Super handy. Now I'll bring down this voice and build my other two in the same way. Oscillator's triangle output to a filter's input to a VCA, get another gate output from PAMs, mult it to trigger an envelope, and ornament and crime channel 2. And the reason I'm staggering my stackables and my regular cables here is just because the jack spacing on these panels is pretty tight, and sometimes the stackables tend to kind of run into each other. So I'm giving them some breathing room. It's another trade-off you have to make when you squeeze everything into a really small space. I think it's worth it to have this entire synthesizer fit in something the size of a briefcase, but I also don't mind being dainty. Envelope 2's output gets multed to filter 2's CV input and to amp number 2's CV input. This eternal spring filter is actually it's really dirty. It has a ton of drive on it. It's actually kind of half distortion, half filter. It's a little ridiculous to use it for a patch like this, but it actually works pretty well. The resonance has a way of making the sound really thin, and you can almost get some sort of piano-y tones out of it. And what we're looking for here is some kind of contrast. I want these voices to have something that separates each of them from the other. So I've done that in a couple ways. I've separated the oscillators by octaves. I'm using filters that have slightly different characteristics, and then we're going to set up the envelopes a little bit differently and add some secret sauce to each of the voices that makes it distinctive. Patch the output of our second Turing machine to the volt per octave input on oscillator 2. See what we get. How about a little reverb? Filter's got a buzz on that high note. I'm going to need some control over the randomization of our second Turing machine for voice number 2, so let's hook up another offset to the CV input. Randomize. Super random. Let's hear how it plays against the bass. Okay, so it's gross. There's a few things we need to do. I want to thin out the density of these notes a little bit, and I'll start with channel 2. We'll turn this from a straight sequence into a Euclidean sequence. We'll make a 5-step Euclidean pattern with 2 steps. And before we go any further, let's quantize. There's another sweet thing about the ornament and crime. Not only does it have 4 Turing machines in it, you can quantize each of them to their own scale. I'll do a Lydian scale. Do the same with the bass. Bring the bass back. Bring it up an octave. There's that high pass, trimming some of the fat. Now both of these voices are playing eighth notes. The bass voice is playing straight eighth notes, and the second voice is playing eighth notes with a Euclidean mask. I want to set up a rule that says, okay bass, you play your straight eighth notes, but don't play on any notes when the second voice is playing. And to do that, we'll set up some logic. Pamela's new workout has some basic logic built in, so let's get into it. I didn't even know this was a thing. They introduced this in the last firmware update, or maybe it was a couple firmware updates ago, but I had no idea. I was really stoked to find this out. I'll go to logic. I'll set it to exclusive OR with channel 2. So now the sequences are playing against each other, and they're never going to sound at the same time. That goes a long way towards making some space for both of these voices to breathe. I'm pretty happy with that. Let's set up our third voice. Triangle output from oscillator number 3. Let's use the carbon filter. Low pass output from carbon goes to a third VCA. Envelope 3 goes to the carbon's FM input with a mult to VCA number 3. This is the kind of patch that will eat up all my stackables. Yep, all I have left is these long red ones. So we'll take channel 3 of PAMs, also playing eighth notes, out to trigger envelope 3. That's okay. Mult that gate to the clock input of our third Turing machine. Run that Turing machine's output to the volt per octave input of oscillator 3. Open up the VCA. Quantize it to our Lydian. So now we need a third offset to connect to channel 3 so that we can control the randomization, but I'm all out of offsets. So let's backtrack a little bit. I'm going to disconnect the CV controls from channel 1 and 2. And I'm going to connect one of these offsets into this 6-way mult. I don't use these very often, but they're really nice to have once in a while. Take 3 splits out of here and connect those to inputs 1, 2, and 3 on Veils. And hey, manufacturers that make this stuff, I would love it, and if there's something like this out there, let me know in the comments. I would love it if someone would make a mult like this that wasn't radial, like taking up the maximum possible amount of space. I mean, it's cute and everything, but what if there was one of these that just was like a little square, and it had 4 jacks on one side and 4 jacks on the other side? I would love that. turn up this offset, and I'll connect my veils outs 1, 2, and 3 to the OC CV inputs 1, 2, and 3. I'll bring these voices back up. Sounds like I bumped my tuning knob. Oh yeah. And something sounds nasty, so I want to find what it is. Let's start here. Do I like that buzz or not? Keep it clean for now. Sounds okay. Oh, it's that top voice. I was pushing the filter really hard, but the frequency was low enough relative to the oscillator's pitch that I did not realize it. This top voice is way too busy, so you guessed it, let's go see Euclid. Make a 7-step sequence with 1 trigger, very sparse. So let's talk again about how these voices are sort of kept distinct from each other and how we make room for each of them. We know that we have them set octaves apart. We have a Euclidean sequence with logic to keep voice number 1 and number 2 out of each other's way. And if you recall, voice number 2 is playing a 5-step sequence with 2 triggers, voice number 3 is playing a 7-step sequence with 1 trigger. We're also taking advantage of the different characteristics of these filters. The bass voice is pretty clean, it's a little bit buzzy, it has a nice punch to it, and I have the cutoff on the high-pass filter turned up a fair bit so that we're emphasizing the sort of buzz. I'm slightly overdriving the filter with the gain, and it's not just pummeling us with all the low bass from that oscillator. Voice number 2 has a pretty similar decay on the envelope. It's funny, it actually looks a little bit shorter based on the knob positions, but to me it sounds a little bit longer. Our ears are just a little more sensitive at those mid-range frequencies. And it might seem odd to use a triangle wave in a subtractive voice without anything else because it's such a clean wave to begin with. There's not that much to scoop off of the high end, but what happens when you get a filter with some nice character, and all these have a nice character, is you drive the input a little bit and it actually generates more harmonics that you then shave off with the filter. And we're barely touching the drive on this filter, we could really dirty it up. One interesting characteristic of this eternal spring filter, and to some extent all resonant filters, at least all the ones I've ever used, have some of this, where when you crank up the resonance, it sort of sucks some of the energy out of the low end and gives us a more mid-rangey sound. I don't understand filter design, I don't know why it's that way, I just know that it's a little more pronounced on this filter than on a lot of other filters I've used. At first I thought, oh that sucks, the resonance isn't very good on this, but it can be a really cool creative effect, and it's really good for stuff like this where you actually want to thin out the sound. The triggers that are firing off voice number 3 are a lot more sparse, and the decay is a lot longer, so it sounds very much like its own thing. I'd like to add some other little quirks to these voices to give them a little bit of personality. I think for voice 2, I'll add a little glide to the pitch CV using a slew limiter. Alright, well I like the way the glides up sound. So I like it sometimes, but not all the time. And I could gate this slew limiter to apply the slides in some random or kind of cyclical way, but I think I'm just going to leave it under manual control right now, so I'll turn up the slide when I want to hear it and down when I don't. Now let's add a little vibrato to the top voice. For that, I'm going to use channel 4 of this quadrax as a bipolar LFO, connect the output of that LFO to channel 4 of my veils, and connect veils output to the exponential FM input. We're just using this as an attenuator, not as a VCA. Really subtle. Less subtle. I think I'm pretty happy with the bass the way it is, so I'm gonna leave it alone. I do wanna get a little delay on this top voice though. So let's patch it up as a send effect using a VCA. And I will just tap into this mult here to grab the voice before it hits the VCA, run it into the next VCA, but instead of feeding channel 4 into the mix with the rest of our oscillators, I'll tap into its direct output, which removes it from the mix, and run that output to the delay's input, turn the delay fully wet. The delay's output, I'll patch over here to mixer input number 4. I don't know why, I just like those effects on 4. Bring up the channel fader for channel 4, and opening up this VCA here, if I did everything right, we'll send voice number 3 to the delay. One cool thing about tapping into the voice for the delay send before it hits the VCA is that we're getting the voice post-filter, but pre-VCA. We're getting access to the voice for our send before the envelope is doing its work on the VCA, which means that we have access to a lot more of the tail of the sound. Like we can feed portions of this signal into the delay that we're not even really hearing because the VCA is fading them out. So we can get these really sort of ghostly, almost like a pedal steel effect. Let me see if I can show you what I mean. Of course, we can grab the attack in there if we want to. Now, one thing I sort of left hanging is, what about the randomization? What about the locking the loop and all that stuff? I just sort of let this play and glossed over it while we got our voices together. So let's come back to that now. We'll turn down voices 2 and 3, so we just have our bass left. I'll bring it up by an octave just so you can hear what's going on a little bit better if you're on small speakers. Each of these first 3 faders on veils corresponds to the amount of randomization for voice 1, 2, and 3. In the fully down or off position, the loop is locked. It's not going anywhere. Let's randomize it. Something I liked, and I locked the loop. I think on this voice it makes sense to lock in the bass voice, and then bring in the middle voice and randomize that and lock it into something that gels with the bass, and do the same for voice number 3. Randomize voice 2 and bring it in. Oh, I'll drop the octave back down on the bass too. Wow, I'm gonna have to edit that quite a bit. I just got about 2 minutes of straight garbage. This'll do. It's definitely like an up to no good type motif. There's a little buzzing from both of these filters. I like the way it ties things together. It might bother me after a while, but I like it right now. Alright, voice number 3. Now that we see how the whole system works, I think it's a good time to talk about, setting yourself up for success with the generative patch. I want to leave enough parameters up to chance that cool and surprising accidents can happen, but I don't want it to be so random that everything comes out sounding like mush. Activating the quantizer was a great start. Now at least everything is constrained at the same scale. But even within a scale, there are notes that rub up against each other. I mean, there are dissonant intervals within a scale. If I wanted to set up everything to be sort of guaranteed, consonant, and pleasing, I could do something like activate a scale mask, which is where you take certain notes out of the scale. So I'm gonna get rid of every other note. Let's say I want like the 1, 3, 5, and I'll do the same for both scales. Now I have a really pleasant sounding triad, and both of these voices can only access notes within that triad, which means it's always gonna sound kind of pleasant. It's always gonna be agreeable like this, which if I were doing a lullaby, might be appropriate. But I'd like to create circumstances where more interesting things can happen. So I'll give it access to more notes in the scale. We can do the same thing with the available range of notes. I can constrain the bass to a very narrow range. which means that nothing terrible is going to happen, but nothing that interesting is going to happen either. If I open the range way up, like some of those notes are subsonic at this point. Oh, that range is wild. I'm going to open up the scale mask on this too. I just wanted to make that point real quick. So when we open up the range and give it access to a wider range of notes, there's more chance that something cool will happen, but also more of a chance that it'll sound like a mess. So we got to find that balance. Another thing that gives us a little control over how chaotic versus how controlled things are is the length of the sequence. Let's lock this bass loop in at 5 steps. I'll drop it down an octave. Bring in voice number 2, random. If I lock in an 8-step sequence, we might be better off shortening the sequence to something like 4 steps, or even 3, and you get a more insistent sort of feel. Kind of good for building motifs, almost like I can picture this belonging to a character who's skulking around. You can think about it like an old-fashioned slot machine, where you have those 3 wheels, and they all got like aces and 7s and cherries on them. If you increase the number of spinning wheels to be like 5 or 8, the odds of getting what you want go way down, but the number of unique combinations goes way up. Or if instead of modifying the number of wheels you're spinning, you make a change to the number of available symbols. If all you have is 7s and cherries, your odds get a lot better of hitting the jackpot. And the analogy breaks down pretty quick because for us, winning is a lot more difficult to define. If we got the musical equivalent of a jackpot on every spin, that would look more like failure than success. So when coming up with a generative idea and trying to make it interesting and trying to make it fun to converse with, maybe a good rule of thumb is, if it feels too chaotic, try constraining it a little more. Limit the range, limit the length of your sequence, limit the available notes. And if it sounds too predictable and it sounds too boring, maybe throw a little more random at it. And leave room for some hands-on, leave room for some conversation with the patch. I'm pulling out this infrared controller. It's a Kommander. I haven't used this in a long time. It's not as useful for some things as I thought it would be because the response is so exponential. It's like a proximity sensor, so the closer you get to it, the more CV it puts out. But it's like you get nothing, 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 and all the action happens right here. So it's very squirrely, and just putting it through an attenuator doesn't really fix that. It's something about the curve. But it's actually pretty good for something like an effect send. So I'm going to wire it into the VCA that's controlling our delay send. Grab a little ball of this handy tack. Not using this sequencer right now, so that's probably okay.